The slimness of the Confederate resources was known only to a handful of men within the limits of strict confidence. Others beyond those limits thought Johnson amply equipped and bountifully supplied, about to launch an offensive. Johnson was therefore in the position of a financier who, to stave off ruin, had overextended his credit to both friends and enemies by putting his name to a sight draft that would come due on presentation. Now that he was in too far to turn back, President Jefferson's message reached him like a notice of proceeding in bankruptcy. Kentucky was the only theater in which there had been no major clash of arms. He must have known that reverses were coming, and he must have known, too, that when they came, the people would not understand. They came soon enough. In fact, they came immediately. Coincident with the return of the messenger, Johnson's right caved in. The troops were scattered headlong, demoralized, and crying like their foes the year before. We are betrayed. Primarily, though, he lost that wing of his army, not because of a federal advance, as he had feared, but because of Zollicoffer's rashness and military inexperience. After occupying Cumberland Gap, the Tennessean had been ordered to move 70 miles northwest to Mill Springs, on the southern bank of the Cumberland River, from which position he could parry an enemy thrust either toward the Gap, where he had posted a guard, or toward Nashville, 150 miles southwest. However, when Crittenden reached Knoxville, assuming command of the region, he learned to his amazement that Zollicoffer had not been content to remain south of the river, but had crossed and set up camp on the opposite bank. Here, at Beech Grove, with the wide, unfordable river to his rear, the Tennessean was defying a Union army twice his size and attempting to stir up the doubtful loyal citizens with proclamations which boldly inquired, "How long will Kentuckians close their eyes to the contemplated ruin of their present structure of society?" Despite this evidence of literary skill, Crittenden now began to doubt the former editor's military judgment, and at once dispatched a courier, ordering him to recross the river. But when he went forward on inspection in early January, to his even greater dismay, he found the citizen soldiers' army still on the north bank. Zollicoffer blandly explained that Beech Grove afforded a better campsite. He had stayed where he was, in hopes that they could talk it over when Crittenden arrived. Then, too, he explained, to the West Pointers' mounting horror, that there were reports that the Yankees were advancing, which made falling back seem a cowardly, or at any rate not a manly, sort of action. Investigation proved that the reports were all too true. Not only were the Federals advancing, they, at their head, the Union-loyal Virginian Thomas H. George. Whatever his fellow Southerners might think of his treachery in not going with his state, they knew him to be an experienced soldier, not the least of his recommendations being that he had been a major in Johnson's 2nd Cavalry. Faced with this threat, Crittenden saw that to attempt to withdraw would be to risk being hamstrung while astride the river. So he assumed command and did what he could to brace his troops in their Beech Grove camp for the shock which he believed was imminent. What came was not the Yankees, but a week of pelting rain. Despite its chill discomfort, he was thankful, for it broadened the river to his rear. It also swelled the creeks to his front and transformed into troughs of mud the road which the Federals were approaching. A continuous quagmire, Thomas called them as his army slogged in double columns along the opposite watersheds of Fishing Creek, which emptied into the Cumberland, just above the Confederate position. Within 9 miles of the rebel outpost on the 17th, he went into camp near Logan's Crossroads to rest his men, dry out their equipment, and plan the assault against Beech Grove. The rain continued all the next day, affording Thomas little respite, but presenting Crittenden with what he believed was a chance to exchange probable defeat for probable victory. In its separate camps, the enemy force was still divided by Fishing Creek, which Crittenden figured was swollen now past fording. He would move his army out that night and strike the Union left in a dawn attack. Then, having destroyed or scattered it, he would turn and deal with the other wing, beyond the forded creek. It was a gamble, even a desperate one, but after a week spent sitting in the rain, waiting destruction, while the river ran deeper and swifter at his back, it was a gamble he was glad to take. Zollicoffer approved as soon as he heard the plan, and at midnight the 2 brigades, 8 regiments of the infantry, plus a 6-gun battery and a cavalry battalion, set out on their march through mud and rain to fight the battle variously known as Mill Springs, Fishing Creek, and Logan's Crossroads. They soon discovered the accuracy of the description the Federal commander had given of the roads, and after a nightmare march through shin-deep mud, with rain coming hard in their faces out of the darkness, revived only by the blinding glare of lightning as they hauled at the wheels of bogged-down cannons and wagons at the head of foundered horses. They discovered something else about George Thomas. They were launching a surprise attack against a man who could not be surprised, whose emotional makeup apparently excluded that kind of reaction to any event. Imperturbable, phlegmatic, his calm was as unruffled in a crisis as his humor was heavy-handed. Lincoln had hesitated to make the 45-year-old Virginian a brigadier, having doubts about his loyalty, but when he questioned Sherman and got the Ohioans' quick assurance that he personally knew Thomas to be loyal, he went ahead and signed the commission. Coming away from the interview with the president, Sherman ran to his friend on the street. "Thomas, you're a brigadier general," he gallantly announced. When Thomas showed no elation at this, Sherman began to have doubts. "Where are you going?" he asked, fearing he might be on his way to the War Department with his resignation, like so many other Virginians. "I'm going south," Thomas replied glumly. "My God, Tom," Sherman groaned. "You've put me in an awful position. I've just made myself responsible for your loyalty." "Give yourself no trouble, Billy," Thomas said. "I'm going south at the head of my troops." That was where he was going now. After a night and a day and another night spent in bivouac around Lincoln's Crossroads, straddling Fisher's Creek, he sent the cavalry patrol out into stormy dawn of the 19th to explore the roads leading south toward the Confederate camp. There was a splatter of musketry beyond the curtain of rain, and presently the horsemen reappeared, riding hard back up the paddled road, shouting that they had run into rebel skirmishers in advance of a heavy column. The long roll sounded. Men came stumbling, big-eyed out of their tents, clutching weapons and clothes, and formed their regimental lines as if for drill, despite the rain and the fact that it was Sunday. All this while, beyond the steely glitter of the rain, an intermittent banging warned that the pickets were engaged. It sounded more like range firing than a battle. But then the pickets came running in front of a double bank of men in muddy gray. Crittenden kept coming. The cavalry clash had cost him the advantage of a complete surprise. But he knew his troops were in better shape for an assault than for a retreat back down 9 miles of churned-up road. Zollicoffer launched the attack, and at first he met with some success. The Federals recoiled from that first shock, but things went wrong in the Confederate ranks almost from the beginning. The men were cold and hungry, exhausted from their all-night march. The exhilaration of the charge burnt up what little energy they had left. Also, their flintlocks would not fire when wet, and the regiments armed with them had to be sent to the rear. Discouraged by all of this, they saw the blue troops massing thick and thicker as Thomas brought up reinforcements from across the creek, whose flood stage Crittenden had misestimated. The crowning blow, however, came when Zollicoffer lost his sense of direction in the rain. Conspicuous in a white rubber coat that made him an ideal target, he rode out between the lines, got turned around, and nearsightedly mistook a Federal colonel for one of his own officers. At this point his luck, which had been running strong, ran out. He was shouting an order when the colonel, a man who recognized an advantage when he saw one, leveled his revolver and put a bullet point-blank into Zollicoffer's breast. A wail went up from the gray ranks. The Tennessean's men had loved him in spite of his rashness, if not, indeed, because of it. Their strength was mostly spent, and now this loss, occurring in plain view, cracked their spirit. They turned and made for the rear. "Betrayed!" they cried as they brushed past their officers. They ran, and they kept on running. Their panic infected the other brigades, which also broke. It was Belmont in reverse, except that the Confederates had no gunboats to fall back on, or transports waiting to bear them away. Thomas replenished his ammunition and set out in pursuit, but his adversaries were well down the Beech Grove road by then. Under cover of darkness, they crossed the Cumberland in relays on a rickety stern-wheeler, which they burned against the southern bank. In the battle and the evacuation, they lost more than 500 men, while the Federals losing less than half as many, captured 12 guns, 1,000 horses and mules, 150 wagons, and half a dozen regimental colors. By the time the pursuers could effect a crossing, there was scarcely anything left to pursue. Retreating through a region which so many of its men called home, Crittenden's army had practically ceased to exist.